A sudden jolt, then a sound, the kind a person hears only once in their life. Metal tearing itself apart. And then, people start screaming. 1800s, late at night. A passenger train is racing through the mountains. Rain falls lightly, the rails are slick, and cold wind cuts through the darkness. Inside, passengers sit quietly, some asleep, some staring out into the black void beyond the windows, thinking this is just another ordinary journey. Then, the train shakes. Once. Then again. Harder this time. Luggage falls from overhead racks. People grab onto whatever they can. No one understands what's happening, because outside, everything still looks normal. But inside the engine, something is breaking. The driver grips the controls tighter. He pulls the brake. He adjusts the throttle. The machine responds, but not the way it should. It listens, but it doesn't obey. As if control is slipping out of his hands. And then, the wheels lose their grip. For a split second, everything feels slow. And then suddenly, too fast. The balance is gone. The carriages begin to slam into each other. Passengers try to stand, but they can't. The floor shifts beneath them. And then, the train leaves the track. Metal tears apart. Wooden compartments splinter. Glass explodes into the air. Screams fill the darkness. Smoke rises. And then, silence. Only the wind moves now, and the smell of broken iron lingers in the air. But this is not where the story ends, because the real question begins here. This wasn't just an accident. The driver was experienced. The track had been used before. The weather was bad, but not bad enough to destroy an entire train. So what actually happened? At first, people said it must have been human error. But when the investigation began, something strange came to light. The machine had failed. But why did the machine fail? How does an engine built to carry people safely turn into something that destroys them in seconds? And the most disturbing part? This wasn't the first time. There had been reports before. Engines behaving strangely, pressure acting unpredictably, delayed responses. But no one took it seriously, because as long as the machine keeps moving, no one questions it. And maybe, on that night, the warning had already come. But the real question is, if there was a warning, why didn't anyone stop it? In the 1800s, trains weren't just machines. They were lifelines. Entire cities depended on them. People traveled for days just to reach work, family, survival. Goods moved across impossible distances. Coal, food, supplies, everything flowed through iron tracks carved into the land. If the train stopped, everything stopped. That was the reality. And nowhere was that reality more fragile than in the mountains. Steep gradients, tight, unforgiving curves, rails that turned slick with rain and cold. Up there, gravity wasn't just a force, it was an enemy. Trains didn't glide through those regions, they fought their way through them. Engines strained, wheels slipped. Sometimes entire trains would stall halfway up a climb, unable to move forward and too dangerous to roll back. And every time that happened, one question echoed across the railroads. How do you move something that doesn't want to be moved? At first, the answer seemed simple. More power. Bigger engines, heavier machines, more force pushing against the mountain. And for a while, it worked. Stronger locomotives began to appear. They pulled heavier loads. They climbed higher. They moved faster than anything before them. Rail companies celebrated. Engineers believed they had solved the problem. But something else changed too. Something quieter. As power increased, so did pressure. As engines grew stronger, they also became harder to control. It wasn't obvious at first. Most runs ended safely. Most journeys were completed without incident. But occasionally, an engine would behave strangely. A delayed response, an uneven pull, a moment where the machine didn't react the way it should. Small things, easy to ignore, because the train still moved, because the system still worked, and because stopping the system was never an option. Schedules had to be met, cargo had to be delivered, passengers had to arrive. So the machines kept running, even when they showed signs of strain, even when they hinted at something deeper. And slowly, without anyone realizing it, the balance began to shift. The machines were no longer just tools. They were becoming something else. Something that required constant control, constant attention, constant risk. And yet, people trusted them, every single day. But here's the question no one wanted to ask. If these machines needed perfect conditions to stay safe, what would happen when something wasn't perfect? The solution didn't arrive quietly. It arrived in iron. Bigger, heavier, more powerful than anything that had come before. Engineers redesigned the locomotive from the ground up. Larger boilers, stronger frames, more driving force pushing into the rails. These weren't just improvements. This was a transformation. The idea was simple. If the mountains were the problem, then build a machine strong enough to overpower them. And at first, it worked. The new engines didn't hesitate on climbs. They didn't stall halfway. They pulled loads that older machines couldn't even attempt. Where trains once struggled, these machines advanced, slowly, relentlessly, almost effortlessly. Railroad companies saw progress, engineers saw success, and the world moved forward. But something else moved with it, something no one was measuring. Because while the machine looked stronger on the outside, inside, it was becoming more complex, more sensitive, more dependent on perfect balance. These engines weren't just powerful, they were precise. Every part had to work in harmony. Pressure had to stay within limits. Heat had to be controlled. Force had to be distributed evenly. And as long as everything stayed in sync, the machine performed beautifully. But if even one thing slipped, just slightly, the system didn't adjust, it reacted. A delayed response, a sudden surge, an unexpected shift in force. Moments so brief they could be missed, but strong enough to change everything. Drivers began to notice it, not clearly, not immediately, just a feeling. That sometimes the engine didn't behave the same way twice, that sometimes it pulled harder than expected, or slower, or unevenly, and there was no clear reason why. But the train still moved, because progress had already been declared, because results mattered more than doubts, and because questioning the machine meant questioning the entire system built around it. So the engines kept running, day after day, load after load, pushing against the limits they were designed to handle, and maybe just a little beyond them. But here's the part no one fully understood. The more powerful the machine became, the less forgiving it was. It didn't tolerate mistakes, it didn't allow imbalance, and it didn't warn you when something was about to go wrong. It simply reached a point and then reacted. And by the time it reacted, it was already too late. But that raises a question that changes everything. If the machine only worked perfectly under perfect conditions, what happened the moment those conditions broke? The danger wasn't obvious. It didn't sit on the surface. It didn't make noise. It didn't announce itself. It stayed hidden, inside the system. Because these engines didn't fail all at once. They failed quietly. At the center of it all was something simple: heat, pressure, balance. Inside the engine, water was constantly being heated, turning into steam, building force. That force moved everything: wheels, pistons, motion. As long as that pressure stayed controlled, the machine lived. But if something disrupted that balance, even slightly, the same force that powered the train could destroy it. And the most dangerous part, the system relied on one thing to stay safe: measurement. Drivers didn't see inside the engine. They didn't see the heat building or the metal straining. They trusted what the gauges told them: water level, pressure, temperature. If the readings looked normal, everything was assumed to be normal. But what if those readings weren't accurate? What if the system that was supposed to show the truth was lying? There were moments, rare but real, when gauges didn't respond correctly, when pressure changed faster than the needle could show, when water levels dropped what appeared stable. Not often, but enough. Enough to matter. Because in a system like this, timing was everything. A delay of seconds could mean the difference between control and collapse. And here's where it became dangerous. The engine didn't give clear warnings. No loud alarms, no visible signs, just small, subtle shifts. A slightly uneven pull, a vibration that lasted a second too long, a response that felt just a fraction delayed. Things that could be explained away, ignored, forgotten. Because most of the time, nothing happened. The train continued. The system held. The machine survived. Which made it even easier to believe that it always would. But that belief was the real risk. Because the system wasn't designed to fail slowly. It was designed to work. Until it didn't. And when it didn't give you time to react. It skipped the warning stage. It went straight to consequence. And by the time the danger became visible, it was already in motion. But here's the question that should have stopped everything. If the machine depended on perfect readings to stay safe, and those readings could be wrong, how long could it run before something went unnoticed? By the time the train reached the mountains, everything depended on two people: the driver and the fireman. No automation, no backup systems, no second chances. Just two men and a machine that demanded perfection. Inside the cab, the world felt different. Louder, hotter, more intense. The engine didn't just move, it roared. Metal clanged, steam hissed. The entire machine pulsed with force. Every movement sent vibrations through the floor, through the controls, through their hands. And in the middle of all that noise, they had to stay focused. Every second. The driver watched the track ahead. Speed, curves, gradient. The fireman watched the system. Fuel, heat, water. Two separate roles, one shared responsibility. Keep the machine stable. Because stability wasn't automatic, it had to be maintained. Constantly. The fireman checked the gauges. Water level, steady. Pressure, within range. Everything looked normal. But experience told him something else. A feeling. That something wasn't quite right. Not enough to stop the train, not enough to raise an alarm, just enough to create doubt. And doubt in a system like this was dangerous, because doubt slows decisions, and hesitation, even for a moment, can change outcomes. The engine responded to inputs, but not always consistently. Sometimes it pulled harder than expected. Sometimes it lagged. Small differences, but noticeable. The driver adjusted the throttle. The machine reacted, but not smoothly. There was a slight delay, then a sudden push, as if the engine was catching up to itself. The fireman glanced again at the gauges. Still normal, but the rhythm felt off. The sound of the engine, slightly different, subtle, easy to ignore. And that was the problem. Because nothing had failed yet, the train was still moving, the system was still functioning, which meant there was no clear reason to stop. And stopping was never taken lightly. Schedules mattered, cargo mattered, passengers mattered. The system didn't reward caution, it rewarded completion. So they kept going, even as the machine demanded more attention, even as the small inconsistencies began to repeat, even as the feeling grew stronger, that something inside the engine wasn't behaving the way it should. But without proof, there was nothing they could act on. And that's what made it dangerous, because the system didn't break in obvious ways. It shifted, quietly, gradually, until the moment came when it stopped being manageable and turned into something else entirely. But here's the question that no one in that cab could answer in time. If the machine was already unstable, how close were they to the point where control would no longer matter? It happens in a moment, not slowly, not gradually. 1 second, the train is moving. The next, everything changes. A sharp jolt runs through the engine, not like before, stronger, violent. The driver feels it instantly. His hands tighten around the controls. He pulls the brake harder this time. The system responds, but too late. There's a delay, a fraction of a second, but in a machine moving at speed, that fraction is everything. The engine surges forward. Then, the wheels slip. The grip is gone. Steel against steel loses its hold, and suddenly the entire train is no longer controlled by the driver. It's controlled by momentum. Carriages slam into each other from behind. The force travels through the entire length of the train like a shockwave. Passengers are thrown from their seats. Some try to stand. They can't. The floor shifts beneath them. The driver pulls again. Nothing. The response isn't just delayed now, it's unpredictable. The engine shakes, not rhythmically, not like normal vibration. This is different, unstable, as if something inside is no longer aligned. The fireman looks at the gauges. They still read normal, but the machine doesn't feel normal. And that's when it happens. A loud metallic crack. Not from outside, from within. Something gives. The balance breaks completely. The front of the train begins to veer, just slightly at first, then more, then too much. The leading wheels leave the track, and once the engine goes, everything follows. The first carriage derails, then the second, then the rest. Each one hitting the next with increasing force. Wood splinters, glass shatters, metal twists under pressure it was never meant to handle. Inside, chaos takes over. People scream. Some are thrown forward, others pinned beneath collapsing structures. There is no time to react, no time to understand, only impact. And then, it stops. Abruptly, violently. The motion ends, but the damage doesn't. The engine lies ahead, separated from the rest of the train. Carriages are scattered, some overturned, some crushed, some barely recognizable. Smoke rises slowly into the cold air. The sound is gone now, replaced by something worse. Silence. Not complete, but heavy, broken. The kind of silence that follows something irreversible. And in that silence, the truth begins to settle. This wasn't a simple derailment. This wasn't just bad weather. This wasn't just a mistake. Because everything that led to this moment had already been happening. The instability, the delayed response, the subtle shifts in behavior. The signs were there. They just didn't look like danger until they became it. And by then, it was already too late. But here's the question that changes everything. If the machine showed signs before it failed, why didn't those signs stop it? By morning, the wreckage had already drawn a crowd. Railroad officials, investigators, workers, all standing in silence, staring at what was left. The train wasn't just damaged, it was scattered. Pieces of metal twisted into shapes that didn't make sense. Wooden compartments crushed inward, the engine separated, sitting ahead like it had tried to escape the destruction it caused. At first, the explanation seemed obvious. A difficult track, bad conditions, too much speed. But as the investigation began, those explanations started to fall apart. The track was examined. No major faults. The weather was reviewed. Challenging, but not extreme. The driver's record. Experienced, reliable, no history of reckless operation. So if the track was stable, the weather was manageable, and the driver knew what he was doing, then what caused this? That question didn't have a simple answer, because the failure wasn't located in one place. It wasn't a single broken part. It was a chain, a system that depended on balance slowly drifting out of it. Investigators began looking deeper into the engine's behavior before the crash. Reports from previous runs surfaced, mentions of inconsistent response, moments where the machine didn't react as expected. Nothing serious enough to stop operations, but enough to raise questions. Questions that were never fully answered. Because the system didn't demand answers, it demanded performance. As long as the train moved, as long as schedules were met, as long as cargo arrived, the machine was considered functional, even if it wasn't stable. And that's where the truth became difficult to ignore. This wasn't an unpredictable accident, it was a predictable outcome. A system built to operate at its limits eventually reached them, and when it did, it failed all at once. The investigation report didn't say it like that. It used technical language, mechanical instability, loss of traction, failure under load. But behind those words was something simpler. The machine was never fully under control. It only appeared to be. And the moment that illusion broke, so did everything else. But there was something even more unsettling. Nothing fundamentally changed after. Yes, procedures were reviewed. Yes, minor adjustments were made. But the core system, it remained the same. Because replacing it wasn't easy. It required time, money, a complete shift in thinking. And until that happened, the trains kept running. The same designs, the same risks, the same silent instability. Waiting. And that raises a question no report could answer. If the system that caused this disaster continued to exist, how many more failures were already on their way? Time moved on. The wreckage was cleared. The reports were filed. The tracks were repaired. And eventually, the trains ran again. At first, nothing seemed different. New journeys began. New passengers boarded. The system continued, almost as if nothing had happened. But something had changed. Not in the machines, but in how people saw them. Because once you've seen what a machine can do when it fails, you don't look at it the same way again. The illusion of control fades, and in its place, a question remains. How safe is something that only works when everything is perfect? For years, engineers had focused on one goal: more power, stronger engines, heavier loads, faster movement. And they achieved it. They built machines capable of overcoming mountains. But in doing so, they created systems that depended on precision, on balance, on conditions that couldn't always be guaranteed. And that was the trade. Power came with risk. But risk wasn't always visible. It didn't show itself during success. It hid inside it. Every smooth journey, every completed trip made the system feel reliable, until the moment it wasn't. And that moment didn't arrive gradually. It arrived instantly, without warning, without time to react. And that's what made it dangerous, because the failure wasn't part of the process. It was outside of it, something the system didn't account for until it was too late. Eventually, change came, not because the system wanted to improve, but because it had to. New designs replaced old ones, safer mechanisms were introduced, more control, more feedback, more awareness of what could go wrong. But even then, the lesson wasn't fully understood, because the pattern didn't disappear. It evolved. Machines became more advanced, more powerful, more efficient, but also more complex. And complexity carries the same risk: hidden failure, delayed response, unexpected behavior. The same conditions, just in a different form. And that brings us back to the beginning. A train in the night, a system under pressure, a moment where everything seems normal until it isn't. Because the truth is, machines don't become dangerous on their own. They become dangerous when we believe they're fully under control, when we stop questioning them, when we trust them completely. And maybe that's the real story. Not just of one train, not just of one accident, but of every system we build. Because even today, we're still chasing power, still pushing limits, still believing we understand everything we create. But the question remains, the same one that should have been asked back then. If a system only works when nothing goes wrong, what happens when something finally does?